Welcome to a journey through time, a grand exploration into the heart of a continent that is as much an idea as it is a physical place. Europe. The name itself resonates with the weight of empires, the whispers of ancient myths, the clash of armies, and the birth of revolutionary ideas that have shaped the entire world. It is a continent of staggering diversity, a mosaic of languages, cultures, and landscapes packed into a relatively small corner of the globe. From the sun-scorched shores of the Mediterranean to the frozen tundras of the Arctic, its geography has profoundly influenced the destiny of its peoples. But the story of Europe is not merely a tale written in stone and soil. It is also a narrative woven from the threads of shared memory, collective identity, and an ongoing conversation about what it means to be European. Our quest in this exploration is to unravel this complex story. We will venture back over 40,000 years, long before the first maps were drawn or the first histories were written, to a time when the land was a raw, untamed wilderness. We will seek to understand how this vast peninsula, jutting out from the western edge of the great Eurasian landmass, became a cradle for civilizations that would eventually touch every other part of the planet. This is not just a chronicle of kings and queens, of battles won and lost. It is the story of the land itself, of the people who first called it home, of the languages they spoke, the gods they worshipped, and the powerful migrations that continuously reshaped its demographic and cultural landscape for millennia. To truly comprehend Europe today, with its political unions, its national rivalries, and its vibrant cultural tapestry, we must first look to its origins. The very concept of Europe is an invention, a name born from a myth that speaks of abduction and a journey across the sea. This myth itself is a powerful metaphor for the continent's own story, a history defined by movement, by the absorption of outside influences, and by the constant redefinition of its own boundaries, both physical and conceptual. We will trace this idea from its mythical beginnings in the ancient Greek world to its modern incarnation as a geopolitical entity, examining how the definition of Europe has expanded, contracted, and evolved through the ages. This series will guide you through the pivotal moments that forged the continent's character. We will stand in awe of the artistic genius of Ice Age hunters, witness the revolutionary shift from foraging to farming, and follow the great waves of migration that brought new peoples and new languages to its shores. We will explore the rise and fall of mighty empires, from the unifying force of Rome to the fragmented kingdoms of the medieval period. We will delve into the myth that gave the continent its name and watch as that name transforms into a powerful symbol of identity. Join us as we embark on this epic journey to uncover the deep, intricate, and often surprising story of Europe, from its prehistoric dawn to its modern-day complexity. Our story begins in a world almost unrecognizable to us now, a world draped in ice and ruled by harsh, unforgiving climate. Long before the first cities rose, before future languages were spoken, the land we now call Europe was a vast and wild frontier. During the peak of the last ice age, some 40,000 years ago, immense glaciers covered much of its northern territories, and icy winds swept across the plains where great capitals would one day stand. It was into this formidable environment that the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, made their momentous entry, venturing out of Africa and the Near East to establish a new home in the West. These were the true pioneers of Europe, the continent's first settlers. These early modern humans, often referred to as the Cro-Magnons, were not primitive brutes shuffling through the snow. They were resourceful, intelligent, and highly adaptive survivors. They organized themselves into small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers, constantly on the move as they followed the great herds of megafauna that roamed the glacial landscape. Their survival depended on their mastery of the environment, their ability to craft sophisticated tools from stone, bone, and antler, and their capacity for complex social cooperation. They hunted formidable prey like the woolly mammoth, the wild horse, and the giant reindeer, animals that provided not just food but also hides for clothing and shelter, and bones for tools and art. The most profound legacy these early Europeans left behind is not etched in the landscape, but deep within it. In the hidden recesses of caves across what is now Spain, France, and Germany, they created some of the most breathtaking and enigmatic art the world has ever known. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet are not mere doodles. They are masterful expressions of a sophisticated symbolic culture. With pigments made from charcoal and ochre, these Ice Age artists brought their world to life on the cavern walls, depicting the powerful animals they hunted and revered with astonishing realism and grace. These subterranean galleries serve as a silent testament to their complex minds, their spiritual beliefs, and their deep connection to the natural world. This was Europe in its infancy, a time of raw elemental existence. Fire, language, tools, and art were the foundational pillars of these first societies. Life was precarious, a daily struggle against cold and hunger, yet it was also a life rich with culture and meaning. These small mobile communities laid the very first cultural foundations upon which all subsequent European history would be built. They were the ancestors, the silent witnesses to the dawn of a continent. Their echoes resonate through the millennia, reminding us that the story of Europe is, at its core, a story of human resilience, creativity, and the enduring quest to make a mark upon the world. For tens of thousands of years, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle defined human existence across the European continent. But around 9,000 years ago, a profound transformation began to ripple across the land, initiating a change so fundamental that it would irrevocably alter the course of history. This was not a revolution of swords and spears, but one of seeds and soil. The Neolithic Revolution, or the New Stone Age, introduced the revolutionary concept of agriculture to Europe, planting the seeds of civilization itself. This monumental innovation did not spring from European soil. Instead, it was a powerful idea that migrated from the east, originating in the fertile river valleys of the Middle East, a region known as the Fertile Crescent. The arrival of farming was not a single event, but a slow, creeping wave of change that spread from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, into the Balkans, and then gradually radiated outwards across the continent. This wave was carried by people. Migrating farmers and herders traveled by land and by sea, bringing with them not just new knowledge, but also domesticated plants like wheat and barley, and animals like sheep, goats, and cattle. They also brought new technologies, including polished stone tools, pottery for storing food and water, and the skills to build permanent settlements. This influx of new people and new ideas marked one of the most significant demographic and cultural shifts in Europe's entire history, setting it on a completely new trajectory. The transition from a nomadic hunting and gathering existence to a settled agricultural life was monumental. Farming allowed communities to produce a surplus of food, which in turn enabled populations to grow far beyond what the land could support through foraging alone. For the first time, people began to live in permanent villages, constructing sturdy houses and developing a deeper attachment to a specific piece of land. This newfound stability fostered the development of more complex social structures, the specialization of labor, and the establishment of early trade networks that connected distant communities. By 5000 BCE, the agricultural way of life had taken firm root across much of southern and central Europe, forever changing its landscape and its people. Alongside these tangible migrations of people and technologies, another kind of story began to take shape. The story of myth. As societies grew more complex, so too did their cosmologies and foundational tales. It is from this era of ancient connections between the Aegean and the Near East that the myth of Europa first emerged. The tale of a beautiful Phoenician princess named Europa, abducted by the god Zeus, disguised as a magnificent white bull, and carried across the sea to the island of Crete, is more than just a captivating story. It is a powerful allegory for the continent's own origins, symbolizing the transfer of culture, knowledge, and people from the older civilizations of the East to the nascent lands of the West. This myth would one day give the entire continent its name. The agricultural revolution laid the groundwork, but the story of Europe was about to be shaped by another transformative force, one that would define its linguistic and genetic map for all time. Around 3000 BCE, a new wave of migrants began to sweep out of the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. These were the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a semi-nomadic people from the Pontic Caspian steppe, who brought with them a potent combination of new technologies and a new language family. Their arrival marked a pivotal turning point. introducing innovations that would give them a decisive advantage. They were masters of animal husbandry, and crucially, they were among the first to domesticate the horse for transport and to utilize the revolutionary invention of the wheeled cart. This mobility gave the Indo-European speakers an unprecedented ability to travel vast distances, spreading their culture, their genes, and their language across Europe. Their influence was so profound that today the vast majority of European languages, from English and Spanish in the West to Russian and Greek in the East and even extending to Persian and Hindi in Asia, are believed to have descended from this single ancestral tongue. Their descendants would eventually coalesce into some of the most recognizable peoples of ancient Europe, the Celts, who would dominate the West, the Italic peoples who would found Rome, the Hellenic tribes who would build the glory of Greece, and the Germanic and Slavic peoples who would shape the continent's future in the north and east. As these new populations settled and merged with the existing Neolithic farmers, Europe entered a new phase of technological and social development. The discovery of metallurgy, first with copper and then by mixing it with tin to create a stronger alloy, ushered in the Bronze Age. This era was characterized by the rise of powerful tribal chiefdoms and warrior elites whose status was defined by their control over the trade of precious metals and their possession of gleaming bronze weapons and ornaments. Great trading networks crisscrossed the continent, connecting the amber coasts of the Baltic with the sophisticated civilizations of the Mediterranean. It was a time of heroes and legends, of fortified hill forts, and of the construction of monumental ritual landscapes like Stonehenge. This age of bronze eventually gave way to the age of iron. The widespread availability of iron ore made metal tools and weapons more accessible than ever before, democratizing technology but also intensifying warfare. This period saw the flourishing of distinct cultural groups like the Hallstatt and Latène cultures in Central Europe, which are associated with the Celts, a people whose influence once stretched from Ireland to Turkey. In the south, Greek city-states were entering their classical golden age, laying the philosophical, political, and artistic foundations of Western civilization. It was on this complex stage of competing tribes, burgeoning kingdoms, and emerging classical powers that the next great unifying force would arise, an empire that would not only conquer Europe but also begin to stitch it together, Rome. Our story of Europe begins in a world almost unrecognizable to our modern eyes, a continent gripped by the profound cold of the last great ice age. Long before the first cities rose, before the first words of its future languages were ever spoken, the land we now call Europe was a vast and wild frontier. Some 40,000 years ago, immense glaciers, kilometers thick, smothered much of its northern territories, and icy polar winds swept across the plains where great capitals would one day stand. It was into this formidable environment that the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, made their momentous entry. These were our direct ancestors, venturing out of their ancestral homelands in Africa and the Near East to establish a new human presence in the westernmost peninsula of the great Eurasian landmass. They were the true pioneers of Europe, the continent's first permanent settlers. These early modern humans, often referred to as Cro-Magnons after a discovery site in France, were not primitive brutes shuffling through the snow. They were anatomically identical to us, possessing the same cognitive abilities, capacity for complex language, and potential for innovation. They arrived equipped with a sophisticated toolkit of survival strategies honed over millennia. They organized themselves into small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, their lives dictated by the seasons and the migratory patterns of the great herds of megafauna that roamed the glacial landscape. Their very existence depended on their intimate knowledge of the environment, their ability to craft highly effective tools from stone, bone, and antler, and their capacity for complex social cooperation and planning for the future. Their journey across the continent was not a rapid conquest, but a slow generational creep, a gradual expansion into new territories, as populations grew and splintered. They followed the river valleys, the natural highways of the prehistoric world, and adapted to diverse ecosystems, from the mammoth steppes of the east to the sheltered coastlines of the west. They brought with them not just their bodies and tools, but a spark of culture that would ignite in the European darkness. They possessed fire for warmth, cooking, and protection. They had language to share knowledge and build social bonds, and most remarkably, they carried the impulse to create art, to represent their world in symbolic form. Life for these pioneers was a constant, precarious balance. They hunted formidable prey like the woolly mammoth, the steppe bison, the wild horse, and the giant reindeer. These magnificent animals were the lifeblood of their societies, providing calorie-rich food to sustain them through brutal winters, thick hides for clothing and shelter, and strong bones for tools and ornaments. The successful hunt of a single mammoth was a monumental achievement, requiring courage, skill, and collaboration, a moment of great celebration for the entire community. These were the foundational experiences that shaped the first European cultures. The daily reality for the hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe was one of profound connection to the natural world. Survival was a full-time occupation, demanding constant vigilance and deep practical understanding of their surroundings. Their societies were small and egalitarian, comprising extended families who moved together across vast territories. This mobility was key to their success, preventing over-exploitation of resources and allowing them to follow the animal herds that sustained them. They constructed temporary shelters, simple tents made from animal hide stretched over frames of mammoth bones or wood, dismantled and transported as they moved from camp to camp. This nomadic lifestyle defined their existence for 30 millennia. The engine of their society was the cooperative hunt. Unlike solitary predators, humans relied on teamwork and advanced communication to bring down prey many times their size. They used sophisticated hunting techniques, driving herds of animals off cliffs or into narrow ravines for easier dispatch. They developed an arsenal of weaponry, including stone-tipped spears thrown with greater force using an innovative device known as a spear thrower or atlatl. This tool acted as a lever, extending the hunter's arm and multiplying their power. Crucial when getting close to a wounded bison, could be fatal. Beyond the hunt, daily life revolved around processing resources and maintaining social bonds. Back at camp, butchering animals, scraping and tanning hides, repairing tools, and preparing food was communal effort. Women played central roles, gathering edible plants, roots, and berries during warmer months, providing essential nutrients to supplement meat. They were responsible for childcare and crafting clothing, using sharp stone awls and delicate bone needles to stitch together warm garments from fur and leather, essential for surviving glacial temperatures. Every member of the group had a role to play in collective survival. The social fabric was woven together by practical necessity and strengthened by shared rituals, stories, and beliefs. Archaeological finds hint at rich cultural life. They created personal ornaments, necklaces and bracelets made from seashells, animal teeth and carved ivory beads, suggesting concern for personal identity and social status. Careful burial of their dead, sometimes with grave goods like tools or ornaments, implies belief in afterlife or reverence for deceased kin. Within these resilient bands huddled around campfires against the immense cold, the first European social identities began to form, laying the groundwork for all that would follow. The most profound and enduring legacy these first Europeans left behind is not etched into the landscape, but hidden deep within it in the silent subterranean darkness of limestone caves. Here, these Ice Age people created some of the most breathtaking and enigmatic art the world has ever known. The cave paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira are not primitive scrawls of a simplistic people. They are masterful expressions of a sophisticated symbolic culture, a window into the minds of our distant ancestors. Using the natural contours of the rock to create three-dimensional form and with pigments made from ground minerals like ochre and manganese mixed with animal fat or charcoal, they brought their world to life on the cavern walls with astonishing vitality and grace. These deep caves were likely not living spaces, but sacred sanctuaries, special places visited only for ceremonial purposes. The journey into these galleries would have been an awe-inspiring experience in itself, penetrating deep into the earth with only the flickering light of a tallow lamp to guide the way. In this disorienting environment, the painted animals would have seemed to leap and dance in the shifting light, creating a powerful, immersive experience. The art is dominated by the great beasts of the era, powerful bulls, herds of horses, charging bison, and graceful deer. Humans are rarely depicted, and when they are often shown as simple stick figures, sometimes in scenes that suggest shamanic rituals or hunting narratives. The meaning and purpose behind this art remain one of history's greatest mysteries, a subject of intense debate among scholars. Were these paintings part of magical rituals intended to ensure a successful hunt? Were they records of past events or mythological stories passed down through generations? Perhaps they were part of shamanic practices, depicting spirit animals encountered during trance-like states. Or maybe they served as educational tools used in initiation rites to teach younger members of the clan about the animals they depended on and the cosmos they inhabited. The truth is likely a complex combination of these ideas, reflecting a worldview where the boundaries between the human, animal, and spirit worlds were fluid and interconnected. Whatever their precise function, these magnificent works of art demonstrate a cognitive leap, a flowering of the symbolic mind. They show a capacity for abstract thought, for planning, and for creating meaning beyond the immediate needs of survival. In addition to the great murals, these artists also produced a wealth of portable art. Small, exquisitely carved figurines from ivory, bone, and stone. The most famous of these are the so-called Venus figurines, stylized female forms with exaggerated features that may have been symbols of fertility, motherhood, or security. This explosion of creativity, occurring tens of thousands of years ago in the depths of the Ice Age, stands as a silent testament to the complex minds, rich spiritual lives, and deep artistic sensibility of Europe's first people. After dominating the European climate for millennia, the great ice sheets began their final dramatic retreat around 12,000 years ago. This period, known as the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, marked a profound environmental transformation across the continent. As temperatures rose, the glaciers melted, releasing vast quantities of water that reshaped coastlines and carved out new river systems. The barren, open tundra of the Mammoth Steppe gradually gave way to dense, sprawling forests of birch, pine, and oak. This new wooded landscape brought with it completely different animal species. The great herds of mammoth and woolly rhino disappeared forever, replaced by forest dwellers like red deer, roe deer, wild boar, and aurochs, the giant wild ancestor of modern cattle. This dramatic ecological shift demanded an equally dramatic adaptation from Europe's human inhabitants. The old ways of life, centered on the pursuit of massive herds across open plains, were no longer viable. The Mesolithic peoples had to develop new strategies and new technologies to thrive in their new forested environment. Hunting became a more localized and individualized affair, requiring stealth and precision to track animals through the dense undergrowth. This led to the development of new tools, most notably the bow and arrow, which allowed for silent, long-range hunting. They also crafted tiny, razor-sharp stone blades known as microliths, which could be set into bone or wooden handles to create versatile composite tools, like harpoons, sickles, and barbed arrows. With the changing landscape came new sources of food. The rising sea levels and expanding river networks created rich estuaries and wetlands teeming with life. Mesolithic people became expert fishers and fowlers, using sophisticated woven nets, fish traps, and bone hooks to exploit these abundant aquatic resources. Enormous mounds of discarded shells, known as shell middens, found along coastlines from Portugal to Denmark, attest to the importance of seafood in their diet. They also learned to manage the forest itself, perhaps using controlled burning to create clearings that would attract grazing animals. For the first time, we see evidence of more permanent or at least seasonally revisited settlements, often located at the resource-rich intersection of water and land. This new, more sedentary lifestyle fostered regional diversification. As communities became more tied to specific territories, distinct local cultures began to emerge, each with its own unique toolkit and artistic traditions adapted to its specific environment. The Mesolithic was not a period of decline, but one of remarkable innovation and resilience. These hunter-fisher-gatherers successfully managed the transition from a glacial to a temperate world, populating every corner of the continent, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the fringes of the Arctic Circle. They were the masters of this new Europe, living in a world of forests and water, and they set the stage for the next great revolution that was already beginning to stir in the East. As Mesolithic communities gave way to the first farming societies of the Neolithic, a spectacular and enigmatic phenomenon began to sweep across the Atlantic fringe of Europe, from Spain and Portugal up through France, Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Beginning around 4500 BCE, people began to construct massive stone monuments known as megaliths, from the Greek for great stone. These were the first great architectural achievements in European history, feats of engineering and social organization that are still staggering to contemplate today. Using nothing more than levers, ropes, earthen ramps, and sheer human muscle power, these early agricultural communities quarried, transported, and erected colossal stones, some weighing over 40 tons, to create structures that would dominate their landscapes for millennia. These megalithic structures took various forms. The simplest were menhirs, single upright standing stones, sometimes arranged in long, mysterious rows like those at Karnak in France, which stretch for several kilometers. More complex were the dolmens, or portal tombs, which consist of several upright stones supporting a massive capstone to create a single chamber, likely serving as a tomb for an elite family or lineage. The most architecturally sophisticated were the passage graves, such as the magnificent Newgrange in Ireland, which feature a long, stone-lined passageway leading to a central burial chamber, all covered by a huge earthen mound. These tombs were not just burial places, they were precisely aligned with astronomical events, such as the winter solstice sunrise, connecting the world of the dead with the cosmic cycles of the sun. The construction of these monuments speaks volumes about the societies that built them. Building something on the scale of Stonehenge or the Karnak alignments would have required the coordinated labor of hundreds, if not thousands, of people over many years or even generations. This implies a level of social organization far beyond that of a simple village. It suggests the existence of powerful religious or political leaders who could command a large workforce, marshal resources from a wide area, and maintain a shared vision over a long period of time. These monuments were powerful statements anchoring a community to a specific place, legitimizing the authority of its leaders, and serving as a focal point for social and religious ceremonies that would bind the community together. The purpose of these stone monuments was undoubtedly multifaceted, deeply rooted in the beliefs and anxieties of these early farming peoples. As tombs, they were powerful links to the ancestors, who were likely seen as guardians of the land and guarantors of its fertility. By burying their important dead in these permanent monumental structures, communities were making a claim to the land itself, a declaration that this was their ancestral territory. The astronomical alignments suggest they were also celestial calendars, used to track the seasons and determine the correct times for planting and harvesting, a matter of life and death for an agricultural society. They were sacred theatres where the dramas of life, death, and rebirth were played out, connecting the people to their land, their ancestors, and their gods. For countless millennia, stone, wood, and bone had been the essential raw materials of human technology. But as the Neolithic era progressed, a revolutionary new material began to appear in Europe, heralding the end of the Stone Age and the dawn of a new, more dynamic period. This new material was metal. The story began with copper, which was initially valued for its rarity and its beautiful reddish sheen, and was cold hammered into small ornaments and awls. However, true metallurgy, the art of extracting metal from ore using high-temperature fires and casting it into molds, was a transformative discovery. This technology, which first arose in the Balkans around 4500 BCE, allowed people to create objects of a shape and sharpness that were impossible to achieve with stone. The true revolution, however, came with the discovery of bronze. Sometime around 3000 BCE, metalworkers learned that by mixing tin with copper, they could create a new alloy that was far harder and more durable than either metal alone. This innovation kicked off the Bronze Age, an era defined by new technologies, expanding trade networks, and profound social change. Bronze was not just a better material for tools, it was a prestige good. The sources of copper, and especially tin, were rare and geographically scattered. Control over the mining of these ores and the long-distance trade routes that moved them across the continent became a major source of power and wealth, leading to the emergence of a new class of wealthy chieftains and a warrior elite. This new social order is clearly visible in the archaeological record. The simple communal burials of the Neolithic were increasingly replaced by lavish individual burials under large mounds or barrows. In these tombs, powerful individuals were interred with the symbols of their status: exquisite bronze swords and daggers, ornate helmets and shields, and beautiful gold and amber jewelry. This was a more hierarchical and martial society than what had come before. Fortified settlements built on hilltops became common, suggesting that warfare and raiding were now an endemic part of life. The gleaming bronze sword became the ultimate symbol of this new age, a weapon of unprecedented effectiveness, but also a beautiful object that signified the owner's high rank and authority. The Bronze Age laid many of the crucial foundations for the historical Europe that would follow. The extensive trade networks that moved tin from as far away as Britain to the civilizations of the Aegean fostered unprecedented levels of contact and exchange between distant cultures. This was an age of heroes and epic journeys, a time that likely inspired the legends that would later be written down by poets like Homer. This prehistoric period, which began with small bands of hunters surviving on the edge of the ice, was drawing to a close. The introduction of metal had irrevocably changed the continent's social and political landscape, setting the stage for the rise of even larger and more complex societies, the flourishing of distinct cultural groups like the Celts, and the dawn of the Iron Age, which would bring Europe to the very threshold of written history. For tens of thousands of years, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle had defined human existence across the vast landscapes of the European continent. It was a successful adaptation, a life lived in harmony with the natural world. But around 9,000 years ago, a profound transformation began to stir on the continent's southeastern fringes, initiating a change so fundamental that it would alter the course of human history. This was not a revolution of swords and spears, nor a conquest led by kings, but one of seeds and soil. The Neolithic Revolution, or the New Stone Age, introduced the concept of agriculture, planting the seeds not just of crops, but of civilization itself. This monumental innovation did not spring from European soil. Instead, it migrated from the east, carried on a slow tide from its cradle. This great wave of change originated in a region arching from the Nile Valley through the Levant to the river plains of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. Here, over several millennia, local populations learned to domesticate wild grasses like wheat and barley, and to tame wild animals like sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. This package of domesticated species provided a reliable, storable food source, a radical departure from hunting and gathering. This agricultural know-how was cultural capital, a powerful new technology for life. It was from this core region, specifically from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, that the first farmers began to look west towards a new continent. The spread of this new way of life was not overnight, but a slow, creeping process that took thousands of years to traverse Europe. It represented one of the most significant cultural transmissions in human history. The initial leap was made across the Aegean Sea, with farming communities appearing in Greece and the Balkans around 7000 BCE. They brought with them precious seeds and livestock, but also a new worldview. They possessed knowledge of the seasons, of grinding grain, of animal husbandry, and building permanent homes. They also brought new technologies, including polished stone axes for clearing forests, pottery vessels for storing grain, and looms for weaving from flax and wool, fundamentally changing the material culture of the continent. The arrival of agriculture marked the beginning of humanity's effort to reshape the environment. It was a pivotal moment when humans shifted from passive participants to active managers of the ecosystem. This shift in strategy would have profound consequences, triggering a domino effect of social, demographic, and technological change. The simple act of planting a seed in European soil was the start of a new chapter in the continent's story. The old world of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers was about to face a challenge from which it would never recover, as the farmer's field began its conquest of the ancient wilderness. The question of how agriculture spread across Europe has long fascinated archaeologists, who debate the exact mechanism of its transmission. Was it primarily a diffusion of ideas, where local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers saw the benefits of farming and adopted the new techniques from their neighbors? Or was it driven by a diffusion of people, a physical migration of farming populations who expanded into new territories, displacing or absorbing the indigenous inhabitants? Modern genetic studies combined with archaeological evidence have provided a much clearer picture, revealing that the spread of farming was overwhelmingly driven by a large-scale migration. The DNA of early European farmers shows a strong affinity with populations from Anatolia, confirming a mass movement of people from the Near East. This great migration was not a single organized invasion, but a gradual wave-like advance that unfolded over many generations. Small groups of pioneering farmers would branch off from their home villages, seeking new fertile lands to clear and cultivate. They likely followed two main routes. One was a maritime route, with farmers using simple boats to leapfrog along the Mediterranean coastline, establishing new settlements in Italy, southern France, and the Iberian Peninsula. The other was a continental route, a slow advance up the river valleys of the Balkans, following the Danube and Rhine rivers deep into the heart of Central Europe. This advance was slow, averaging perhaps only 1 kilometre per year, but over centuries it completely reshaped the continent's demographic map. The migrating farmers possessed a powerful demographic advantage over the native hunter-gatherer populations. Agriculture, with its stable and abundant food supply, allowed for higher birth rates and supported much greater population densities. A small patch of cultivated land could feed many more people than the same area could support through hunting and foraging. This meant that farming communities grew faster and could expand continuously, while hunter-gatherer groups, with their low population densities and large territorial needs, were slowly but surely outnumbered. The encounter between these two worlds must have been complex, sometimes involving trade and cultural exchange, but often leading to conflict over land and resources as the farmers' frontier advanced relentlessly. This influx of new people from the East represents one of the most significant demographic events in Europe's history, second only to the initial peopling of the continent by modern humans. It created a new genetic landscape, one where the legacy of these Anatolian farmers became the dominant strand in the DNA of most modern Southern and Central Europeans. It was a process of colonization, not by an empire or a state, but by a way of life carried in the bodies and minds of thousands of small family groups. This journey of the first farmers fundamentally transformed the biological and cultural identity of Europe, laying down a new human foundation upon which all subsequent layers of history would be built. The transition from a nomadic hunting and gathering existence to a settled agricultural life was one of the most radical shifts in the human experience. At its heart was the concept of permanence. For the first time, people began to live in fixed locations for extended periods, investing their labor and identity in a specific piece of land. This led to the construction of the first true villages in Europe. Early farming settlements were often small, consisting of a handful of households, but they were built to last. Houses were no longer temporary shelters of hide and branch, but sturdy rectangular structures constructed from timber posts, woven wattle walls daubed with clay and topped with thatched roofs. These longhouses often sheltered not just a single nuclear family, but an entire extended kin group, along with their precious livestock. Life in these early villages revolved around the demanding annual cycle of farming. The year began with the arduous task of clearing the dense primeval forest, using fire and the newly developed polished stone axes to create fields for cultivation. Then came the ploughing, planting, and tending of the crops, a constant battle against weeds and pests. The harvest was a time of intense communal labor, followed by the crucial tasks of threshing and grinding the grain and storing it safely in pottery vessels or subterranean pits to provide food through the long winter months. This new rhythm of life, dictated by the planting and harvesting seasons, instilled a new sense of time and a need for long-term planning that was fundamentally different from the more opportunistic rhythms of the hunt. The landscape itself was profoundly transformed by this new way of life. The patchwork of fields and pastures created by the first farmers represented the earliest human-made environments in Europe. Forests were cleared, ecosystems were altered, and the very appearance of the land began to change. This process also created a new concept of wealth and property. Land, for the first time, became a valuable, heritable resource, a source of identity and conflict. The world was now divided into the tamed and the untamed, the cleared fields of the settlement versus the dark, wild forest that lay beyond. This created a new psychological boundary that would shape European culture for millennia, fostering a deep-rooted connection to the homeland, the patria, that was passed down through generations. This newfound stability and attachment to place fostered the development of a more complex relationship with the past and the future. People were now living on the same land that their parents and grandparents had worked, and they were buried there when they died. This led to a growing importance of ancestry and the veneration of the dead, who were often buried within the settlement, sometimes even under the floors of the houses, keeping them physically and spiritually close to the living community. These permanent villages were more than just collections of houses. They were social and ritual centers, the crucibles in which a new settled European identity was being forged, one plot of land at a time. The agricultural revolution was about much more than just food production. It catalyzed a complete restructuring of human society. The ability to produce and store a surplus of food was the key that unlocked this transformation. For the first time in human history, not everyone needed to be directly involved in the daily quest for sustenance. This allowed for the specialization of labor, a hallmark of all complex society. While most people remained farmers, some individuals could now devote their time to developing other skills. Skilled artisans emerged, becoming expert potters, weavers, and toolmakers. Others may have become priests or shamans, responsible for the community's spiritual well-being, or chieftains who organized labor and mediated disputes. This era saw an explosion in new technologies and crafts, all born from the necessities of a settled agricultural life. Pottery was one of the most significant inventions. Firing clay to create durable, waterproof containers was essential for storing grains safe from moisture and pests, for cooking new types of food like porridge and stew, and for fermenting beverages. Early Neolithic pottery was often beautifully decorated with incised linear patterns, with distinct regional styles that allow archaeologists to trace the movement and interaction of different cultural groups. Similarly, the invention of the loom allowed for the weaving of textiles from plant fibers like flax and animal wool, providing new materials for clothing that went far beyond the simple hide garments of the hunter-gatherer era. The accumulation of food surplus and the development of specialized crafts also led to the birth of trade and the concept of private property. A farmer with a surplus of grain could exchange it for a finely crafted pot, a sharp axe, or livestock from a neighboring village. This created early trade networks that connected communities, allowing for the exchange of not only goods but also ideas and innovations across long distances. With this new wealth came new social dynamics. For the first time, significant material inequality became possible. Some families or individuals, through skill, luck, or force, could accumulate more land, more livestock, or more valuable goods than others, leading to the gradual emergence of social hierarchies and the beginnings of a stratified society. These changes were not always peaceful. The new wealth concentrated in villages, stores of grain, herds of livestock, made them tempting targets for raids. The growing attachment to ancestral lands also created new reasons for conflict between competing groups. Archaeological evidence from this period sometimes reveals settlements protected by defensive ditches and palisades, and skeletons bearing the marks of violent death. The Neolithic Revolution, while providing a more secure food supply, also introduced new social tensions and new forms of organized violence. It set Europe on the path towards greater complexity, but it was a path that would be paved with both remarkable innovation and growing social strife. As settled societies grew more complex and interconnected, so too did their cosmologies and their foundational stories. From the deep well of this era, an age of ancient connections between the Aegean world and the older civilizations of the Near East, a powerful myth began to take shape, one that would eventually give the entire continent its name. This is the tale of Europa, a beautiful princess from the Phoenician city of Tyre on the coast of modern-day Lebanon. According to the ancient Greek story, Zeus, the king of the gods, became infatuated with her beauty. To approach her without startling her or alerting his jealous wife, Hera, he transformed himself into a magnificent, gentle white bull with horns like a crescent moon and mingled with her father's herds. Intrigued by the bull's serene and majestic demeanor, Europa and her handmaidens approached it, adorning its horns with flowers. The bull knelt before her, and feeling emboldened, Europa climbed onto its broad back. This was the moment Zeus had been waiting for. He immediately charged away, plunging into the sea and carrying the terrified princess across the waves. Despite her pleas, the divine bull swam relentlessly westward, finally coming ashore on the island of Crete. There, Zeus revealed his true form and made Europa the first queen of this new land. Her name, which in Greek may have meant wide-gazing or broad-faced, came to be associated with the lands to the west of the Aegean Sea, the continent that would forever bear her name. This captivating story is far more than just a fanciful tale of divine abduction. It functions as a powerful allegory for the continent's own prehistoric origins. Europa, the princess from the east, represents the transfer of culture, knowledge, and innovation from the older, more established civilizations of the Levant and Anatolia. The bull, a potent symbol of strength and fertility in many ancient cultures, represents the irresistible force carrying these new ideas westward. The sea journey itself symbolizes the physical migration and cultural transmission that brought the Neolithic revolution to Europe's shores. The story beautifully encapsulates the deep-seated historical memory of a foundational transfer of civilization from east to west. The myth of Europa, therefore, serves as a symbolic bookend to the vast unwritten history of the Neolithic migrations. It gives a name and a narrative to a process that unfolded over thousands of years. It acknowledges that the roots of European civilization are not entirely homegrown, but are deeply entangled with the cultures of the Near East. The name Europe itself, born from this story of a journey across the water, is a permanent reminder of the continent's foundational debt to the peoples and ideas that arrived from beyond its shores. This myth, passed down through the ages, became a cornerstone of European identity, a story that explained not just a name, but the very origins of a continental culture. The arrival and spread of Neolithic farmers did not result in an instantaneous transformation of the continent. For thousands of years, Europe was a land of two distinct worlds existing side by side. The agricultural communities with their villages and fields were concentrated in the most fertile regions, the lowest plains and river valleys of Central Europe and the coastal plains of the Mediterranean. But vast tracts of the continent, particularly the heavily forested northern plains, the rugged Atlantic coastlines, and the mountainous interiors, remained the domain of indigenous Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. This created a dynamic and complex frontier between two fundamentally different ways of life, two opposing worldviews competing for the same space. The relationship between these groups was undoubtedly varied and complex. In some areas, there may have been periods of peaceful coexistence and exchange. Hunter-gatherers might have traded wild game, furs, and forest products for the farmers' grain, pottery, or polished stone axes. There is clear archaeological evidence for this interaction, with farmer-made pottery found in hunter-gatherer camps far from agricultural settlements. This suggests the frontier was porous, a zone of cultural and economic exchange. Some hunter-gatherer groups may have selectively adopted aspects of the Neolithic package, such as pottery or domesticated animals, without abandoning their mobile lifestyle, creating unique hybrid cultures. However, the long-term relationship was ultimately one of competition and displacement. The farmers' way of life was fundamentally expansionist. Their growing populations required new land, which meant relentlessly clearing the forests that were essential habitat for the hunters' game animals. Every field ploughed was a loss for the foraging economy. This inherent conflict would have inevitably led to tension and violence. While direct evidence of large-scale warfare is scarce, the increasing prevalence of fortified settlements suggests a world where defense was a growing concern. Genetically, the story is one of gradual replacement, with farmer DNA becoming dominant over time. Ultimately, the hunter-gatherer way of life, which had sustained humanity in Europe for over 30,000 years, could not withstand the demographic pressure of the agricultural revolution. Over 2 to 3 millennia, indigenous Mesolithic populations were slowly absorbed into farming communities or pushed into marginal environments where farming was not viable. By around 4000 BCE, the transition was largely complete in most of Europe. The continent had been fundamentally remade. The hunter's world had faded into memory and myth. replaced by the farmer's world of villages, fields, and domesticated animals, setting the stage for the next great wave of migration and change that would usher in the age of metals. So, just as the agricultural revolution had transformed Europe's cultural and genetic landscape, another monumental wave of change was gathering far to the east, poised to sweep across the continent and once again redefine its destiny. Around 3000 BCE, while Neolithic societies were building their megalithic monuments and perfecting their farming techniques, a new and dynamic culture was coalescing in the vast open grasslands stretching from the northern shores of the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. This region, known as the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, corresponds to what we now call Ukraine and southern Russia. It was the homeland of a semi-nomadic people whose impact on Europe and Asia would be so profound that today we refer to them as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. They weren't a unified empire or nation, but rather a collection of related tribes who shared a common language, a distinct cultural package, and a restless, expansionary energy. These were people shaped by their environment. The steppe was, in a way, a sea of grass, a landscape with few natural barriers, absolutely ideal for grazing vast herds of livestock. Unlike the settled farmers of old Europe, who were tied to their fields, the steppe peoples were pastoralists, their lives revolving around their herds of cattle, sheep, and most importantly, horses. This pastoralist lifestyle fostered a mobile, resilient, and hardy society. They were used to moving over long distances, always seeking new pastures for their animals. Their social structure was likely organized into patriarchal clans and tribes, led by chieftains whose wealth and power were measured in the size of their herds. This mobile way of life would prove crucial as they began to look beyond the horizons of their grassy homeland. The catalyst for their expansion is still a subject of ongoing debate among historians and archaeologists. It might have been driven by environmental factors such as a period of climate change that made their homeland less productive, forcing them to seek greener pastures elsewhere. Or perhaps it was internal social pressures, with growing populations and competition between rival tribes pushing younger groups to seek their fortunes in new lands. Whatever the initial trigger, their expansion was facilitated by new technologies and a martial culture that gave them significant advantage over sedentary farming populations. They were not just migrants, they were conquerors and colonizers. This new force from the east represented a radical break from the cultural traditions of Neolithic Europe. The societies of old Europe tended to be matrifocal, centered on earth, fertility, and collective community, as we see in their female figurines and communal tombs. The newcomers, in contrast, brought a patriarchal, hierarchical, and warrior-centric worldview. Their culture celebrated individual heroism, martial prowess, and the power of sky gods. Their arrival would not be a gentle merging, but a dramatic and often violent collision, a superimposition of a new elite and a new way of life that would fundamentally alter the social fabric, language, and belief systems of the entire continent. The most enduring legacy of the Indo-European migrations is, without a doubt, linguistic. The language spoken on the Pontic-Caspian steppe some 5,000 years ago, which we call Proto-Indo-European, is the ancestor of hundreds of modern languages and dialects spoken by billions of people today. As these tribes migrated out from their homeland in successive waves over many centuries, their language diversified and evolved, branching out into the vast Indo-European language family. One branch moved east, giving rise to the Indo-Iranian languages like Sanskrit, Persian, and Hindi. Another larger branch moved west into the heart of Europe. It is from this western branch that nearly all modern European languages, with the notable exceptions of Basque, Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian, are descended. The similarities between words like three in English, dre in German, tre in Latin, and tri in Sanskrit are not coincidences, but echoes of this shared ancestral tongue. This linguistic transformation was accompanied by a profound genetic shift. Just as the arrival of Anatolian farmers had left a clear genetic signature, the arrival of the steppe pastoralists left another indelible mark on the European gene pool. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletons from this period shows a massive infusion of genetic ancestry originating from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, first appearing in Eastern and Central Europe around 2800 BCE and spreading rapidly westward in the following centuries. In many regions, this new steppe DNA accounts for a significant proportion, sometimes over 50%, of the subsequent population's ancestry. This confirms that the Indo-European expansion was not merely a cultural diffusion, but a large-scale migration of people, with the newcomers imposing themselves as a new ruling class and mixing with the local Neolithic populations. The descendants of these migrations would eventually coalesce into the major ethno-linguistic groups that shaped the future of Europe. One of the earliest waves brought the ancestors of the Hellenic peoples into Greece, where they would eventually build the great Mycenaean civilization. Another wave moved into Central Europe, forming the basis for the Italic peoples, who would one day found Rome, and the Celtic peoples, who would come to dominate Western Europe from Ireland to the Alps. In the north, they became the Germanic tribes, while in the east, they evolved into the Baltic and Slavic peoples. Each of these groups developed its own distinct language, culture, and identity, yet they all carried the shared linguistic and genetic inheritance of their steppe ancestors. The story of this great dispersal is really the story of how Europe's foundational linguistic map was drawn. It explains why an Irishman and a Russian, a Portuguese sailor and a German farmer can trace their languages back to a common source spoken on the Ukrainian plains thousands of years ago. It marked the end of old Europe, the world of the first farmers, and the beginning of a new era. This was a more stratified, more dynamic, and more interconnected Europe, one whose linguistic and genetic foundations were now firmly in place, ready for the dawning of the Bronze Age and the rise of the first great historical civilizations on European soil. The extraordinary success of the Indo-European expansion really can't be understood without appreciating their revolutionary technological package, a trinity of innovations that granted them unprecedented mobility. The first and most important was the domestication of the horse. While horses had been hunted for food for millennia, the people of the steppe were among the first to tame them, initially as a source of meat and milk, but crucially for transport. The ability to ride a horse transformed the human relationship with distance. It allowed pastoralists to manage much larger herds of cattle, to explore vast new territories with speed, and to communicate and coordinate across great distances. The horse was the engine of the steppe economy and the key to its expansionary potential. The second crucial innovation was the wheel. While the concept may have originated in Mesopotamia, it was on the steppe that it was perfected for transport in the form of the wheeled cart or wagon. Suddenly it was possible to move not just people, but heavy and bulky goods, household possessions, and supplies across the landscape with ease. This was honestly a logistical revolution. It meant that migrating groups were no longer restricted to what they could carry on their backs or on pack animals. They could transport their entire households, their food stores, and their families, effectively making their wagons mobile homes. This technology liberated them from the constraints of a single location and enabled true, long-distance, multi-generational migration. The combination of the horse and the wagon was quite simply a game-changer. It created a highly mobile, self-sufficient migratory unit. A tribal group could pack up its entire existence and move hundreds of kilometers in a single season, seeking out new lands and opportunities. On the open terrain of the steppe and the plains of Central Europe, this mobility gave them an immense advantage. It also had profound military implications. While the chariot as a dedicated war machine would come later, horse-riding warriors and mobile groups moving in wagons could outmaneuver and overwhelm the static defensive formations of the settled farming communities. They could strike quickly, raid for cattle and other resources, and disappear before a defense could be effectively mounted. This technological package not only facilitated their expansion, but also shaped their culture and worldview. The wagon became a central feature of their society, a symbol of home and family. The horse was revered, becoming a high-status animal associated with wealth, power, and warfare, a theme that would echo through Indo-European mythology for thousands of years. The societies they created were dynamic and outward-looking, their horizons defined not by the boundaries of a village field, but by how far a horse could travel in the day. This toolkit of mobility was really the physical mechanism that allowed a relatively small population from the steppes to project its power and its language across a vast continent. The arrival of the Indo-European speakers ushered in a new and fundamentally different social structure across Europe. The relatively egalitarian, community-focused societies of the Neolithic farmers were replaced by a more rigid, hierarchical, and patriarchal order. At the apex of this new society stood the warrior chieftain. This was a system built on patronage and personal loyalty, where a leader's authority rested on his ability to attract and reward a retinue of loyal followers. Success in raiding and warfare was the primary path to power and prestige. A successful chieftain would distribute the spoils of war, cattle, metal goods, and captives among his warriors, binding them to him in a cycle of obligation and reward. This created a highly competitive and martial society, starkly different from the cooperative ethos of the farming village. This new social order is vividly reflected in the archaeological record, particularly in the burial customs of the so-called corded ware and bell beaker cultures, which are strongly associated with the spread of steppe ancestry. The communal megalithic tombs of the Neolithic fall out of use, replaced by single grave burials under earthen mounds known as kurgans or barrows. These graves were for individuals, not collectives, and they prominently displayed the status and role of the deceased. Men were typically buried with the tools of their trade, finely crafted stone battle axes, daggers, and archery equipment. These were not just tools, but potent symbols of their warrior status and their place in the new social hierarchy. Alongside the warrior, another powerful figure emerged, the priest. The Indo-Europeans brought with them a complex religious ideology, and a class of ritual specialists was needed to mediate between the human and divine worlds. These priests were the custodians of sacred knowledge, oral traditions, and complex sacrificial rituals. They were responsible for maintaining the cosmic order and ensuring the favor of the gods, which was crucial for the success of the tribe in warfare and for the health of their herds. The famous tripartite ideology proposed by scholar Georges Dumézil suggests that Proto-Indo-European society was conceptually divided into three functions: the sacred sovereignty of the priests, the martial power of the warriors, and the fertility and productivity of the common people, the herders and farmers. This hierarchical structure, with its clear division of roles, proved to be a highly effective model for organizing society and for conquest. It created a clear chain of command and a powerful warrior ethos that glorified heroism and expansion. As these groups moved into Europe, they established themselves as a new ruling elite, imposing their social structure, language, and religion upon the subjugated native populations. Over time, these two groups would merge, but the Indo-European model of a stratified society, led by a warrior aristocracy and a priestly class, would become the dominant paradigm in Europe for millennia, laying the ideological foundations for the chiefdoms, kingdoms, and empires to come. The Indo-European migrants did not just bring new genes and new grammar to Europe, they also brought a new pantheon of gods and a distinct religious worldview. Their beliefs were perfectly suited to their lifestyle as pastoralists living under the vast, open skies of the steppe. Unlike the Earth Mother goddesses and fertility deities that were prominent in Neolithic Old Europe, the Indo-European pantheon was dominated by powerful male sky gods. The chief deity, reconstructed by linguists as Deus Pter, or Sky Father, was a celestial sovereign who ruled over the heavens. His name is the direct ancestor of the Greek Zeus Pater, the Roman Jupiter, and the Vedic Dyaus Peter, showing the remarkable persistence of these religious concepts across the entire language family. Alongside the Sky Father stood a host of other deities associated with the powerful forces of nature that dominated their world. A particularly prominent figure was the Thunder God, a dynamic and heroic warrior deity who wielded a mighty hammer or axe to slay cosmic serpents or dragons, representing the forces of chaos. This figure can be seen in the Norse Thor, the Slavic Perun, the Indic Indra, and the Hittite Tarhunt. There were also gods of the sun and the dawn, divine twins often associated with horses, and gods of war and justice. This was a religion that mirrored their society. It was hierarchical, patriarchal, and celebrated the martial virtues of strength, courage, and decisive action. Ritual played a central role in their religious practice, and the most important rite was sacrifice. This was a transactional relationship with the gods where offerings, often livestock, especially horses and cattle, were made to secure divine favor, ensure victory in battle, or promote the fertility of the herds. These rituals were likely presided over by the priestly class, who knew the correct hymns and procedures to appease the gods. Fire was also a key element in their worship, seen as a sacred messenger that carried the essence of the sacrifice up to the celestial realm. The domestic hearth was itself a sacred space, the center of the family and a link to the ancestors. This new religious system largely supplanted the older beliefs of Neolithic Europe, though it did not erase them entirely. In many places, a process of syncretism occurred, where older goddesses and nature spirits were absorbed into the new pantheon, often as the wives or consorts of the powerful new male gods, or were demoted to lesser roles. This religious transformation was a critical part of the Indo-Europeanization of the continent. It provided a shared cosmic framework, a common set of myths and symbols that helped to unify the new ruling elites across vast distances and legitimize their new social order under the watchful eyes of the powerful gods they had brought with them from the eastern steppes. The Indo-European migrations were not a single event, but a complex, centuries-long process of movement, conquest, and assimilation that completely redrew the ethno-linguistic map of Europe. The result was not a monolithic Indo-European empire, but the emergence of a mosaic of new regional peoples and cultures. As different waves of migrants settled in different parts of the continent and interacted with the diverse pre-existing Neolithic populations, their common ancestral language and culture began to diverge, creating the distinct branches of the European language tree that we recognize today. This was the raw material from which the future nations and peoples of Europe would be forged. In the far west, the blending of steppe migrants with the builders of the great Atlantic megaliths gave rise to the Celtic-speaking peoples. Their culture, characterized by the later Hallstatt and Latina artistic styles, would come to dominate a vast swathe of Europe, from the British Isles and Iberia to the Alps and beyond. In the Italian peninsula, another branch evolved into the Italic peoples, including the Latins, who were destined to build an empire that would unite the continent in a way not seen before. To their east, in the rugged terrain of the Balkans, the Hellenic tribes developed their unique city-state culture, laying the intellectual and artistic foundations of Western civilization itself. Further north, in the forests and plains of modern-day Germany and Scandinavia, the Germanic tribes took shape. These were fierce and independent peoples who would remain largely outside the orbit of the Mediterranean world for centuries before eventually playing a decisive role in the fall of the Roman Empire and the shaping of medieval Europe. To their east, across the great northern plain, the Balto-Slavic branch of the family developed. From this group would emerge the Baltic peoples, the Lithuanians and Latvians, and the far more numerous Slavs, who would eventually populate a vast territory from the Adriatic to the Russian heartland, becoming the largest ethno-linguistic group in modern Europe. By the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, the process was largely complete. The linguistic and genetic foundations of modern Europe had been laid. The old world of the Neolithic farmers, with its distinct languages and cultures, had been almost entirely submerged, surviving only in pockets like the Basque country. In its place was a continent of Indo-European speakers, a tapestry of related but distinct peoples, each with their own territory, traditions, and trajectory. This new configuration of peoples, Celts, Greeks, Italics, Germanics, and Slavs, would form the cast of characters for the next great chapters of the European story, a story of rising empires, clashing cultures, and the slow, often violent forging of a continental identity. The fusion of Neolithic farmer and Indo-European pastoralist cultures really set the stage for Europe's next great technological leap forward. This pivotal moment was sparked by the transformative power of metallurgy. While copper had been known and used for quite some time, it was a relatively soft metal, often used more for ornamentation than for truly functional tools. The true revolution began when ancient metalworkers discovered that by alloying copper with just a small amount of tin, they could create a new material that was exponentially harder, more durable, and capable of holding a much sharper edge. This new alloy was bronze, and its invention, around 3000 BCE, was so impactful that it actually gave its name to an entire epoch, the Bronze Age. The mastery of this technology marked a definitive break from the Stone Age, ushering in a new era of innovation, complexity, and conflict. The production of bronze was a complex and demanding process that required specialized knowledge and resources. Unlike stone, which was pretty much available everywhere, the ingredients for bronze were geographically rare and unevenly distributed. Copper mines were found in places like the Alps, Iberia, and Cyprus, while the far scarcer tin was primarily sourced from remote locations such as Cornwall in Britain or the Ore Mountains in Central Europe. This geological lottery meant that no single region could produce bronze on its own. It necessitated the creation of vast and intricate long-distance trade networks that crisscrossed the continent, connecting communities that had previously lived in relative isolation. The quest for metals became a primary driving force of the age, fostering unprecedented levels of interaction and exchange. The emergence of bronze technology had a profound impact on the structure of society. Because the raw materials and the knowledge to work them were so rare, bronze objects themselves became powerful symbols of wealth, status, and authority. A new class of elites emerged, powerful chieftains and warrior aristocracies, whose power was built upon their ability to control the production and distribution of bronze. Society became more visibly stratified than ever before. This is starkly illustrated in the archaeological record through lavish burials, where chieftains were interred under large earthen mounds or barrows, accompanied by their most prized possessions, gleaming bronze swords, ornate axes, elaborate jewelry, and golden drinking cups. The Bronze Age was truly an age of heroes, a time when individual power and prestige were displayed for all to see. This new technology fundamentally altered the nature of tools and warfare. A bronze axe could clear a forest far more efficiently than a stone one, while a bronze sickle made harvesting grain faster and more effective. But really, the most significant impact was on weaponry. The bronze sword was a revolutionary weapon, offering a combination of slashing and thrusting capabilities that was far superior to the stone daggers and axes of the past. The bronze-tipped spear and the bronze helmet and shield offered new levels of offensive and defensive power. This led to a significant escalation in the scale and intensity of warfare. Fortified hilltop settlements became a common feature of the landscape, a clear testament to an increasingly violent and competitive world where control over resources was fiercely contested. The insatiable demand for copper and tin, the essential components of bronze, turned Europe into a continent of traders and travelers. A complex web of exchange routes stitched the continent together, moving raw materials, finished goods, and new ideas across vast distances. Tin, mined in the misty hills of Cornwall, might be transported by sea and river all the way to the sun-drenched workshops of the Aegean. Amber, the fossilized tree resin known as the gold of the north, was gathered on the shores of the Baltic Sea and traded south, finding its way into the tombs of Mycenaean kings in Greece. In return, manufactured goods like Mediterranean pottery, glass beads, and sophisticated metalwork flowed northward, influencing the styles and tastes of chieftains in Central and Northern Europe. This was really Europe's first great age of international commerce. These trade networks were not just abstract economic systems. They were forged and maintained by the courage and enterprise of individuals. Hardy traders undertook perilous journeys by land and sea, navigating treacherous mountain passes and unpredictable waters in simple logboats or even on foot. They followed ancient trackways, river systems, and coastal routes, creating a shared map of the continent in their collective minds. These journeys facilitated more than just the exchange of goods. They were conduits for culture. As traders moved from one community to another, they brought with them new technologies, artistic styles, religious beliefs, and languages. This constant flow of information and influence ensured that no part of Europe remained entirely isolated, fostering a sense of a wider, interconnected world beyond the local horizon. The wealth generated by this trade fueled the rise of a powerful warrior aristocracy. In this highly competitive society, a chieftain's power depended on his ability to acquire and display prestigious goods. Bronze weapons were not merely functional items, they were works of art, intricately decorated and polished to a brilliant shine, serving as potent symbols of their owner's rank and martial prowess. The possession of a finely crafted sword or an ornate helmet was a public declaration of status. This warrior ethos is celebrated in the epic poems that would later be written down, such as Homer's Iliad, which, although set in a later period, really reflects the heroic values of the Bronze Age, a world where glory, honor, and reputation were won on the battlefield and through the accumulation of treasure. This interconnected world was not always peaceful. The same routes that carried traders could also be used by raiding parties. The concentration of wealth in certain settlements made them attractive targets, and control over strategic trade routes or resource-rich territories was a constant source of conflict. The proliferation of weaponry and fortified settlements across the continent paints a picture of endemic warfare. It was a volatile and dynamic era characterized by a delicate balance between cooperation and conflict, trade and raid. This complex interplay of commerce and combat was the engine that drove social and political development throughout the Bronze Age, shaping the societies that would form the bedrock of classical Europe. In the heart of Europe, north of the Alps, the Bronze Age gave way to a new cultural flourishing that is inextricably linked with the people the Greeks would later call the Keltoi, or Celts. The early phase of this Iron Age culture, beginning around 800 BCE, is known as the Hallstatt culture, named after a spectacularly rich archaeological site by a salt mine in Austria. The wealth of the Hallstatt chieftains was built upon their control of the valuable salt trade, a vital commodity in the ancient world. They were powerful princes who lived in heavily fortified hilltop settlements known as oppida, and were buried in grand timber-lined tombs under massive burial mounds. These burials contain an astonishing array of luxury goods, including imported Mediterranean artifacts, four-wheeled ceremonial wagons, and elaborate bronze and gold drinking vessels, really showcasing their wealth and extensive trade connections. Around 450 BCE, a new and vibrant artistic style emerged from the Hallstatt foundation, signaling a cultural shift. This is known as the Latène culture, named after a site in Switzerland where a vast trove of metalwork was discovered. The Latène style represents the pinnacle of Celtic art. It's a dynamic and abstract art form characterized by swirling, curvilinear patterns, stylized animal forms, and intricate geometric designs. This art decorated everything from swords and shields to torques, the heavy twisted metal neck rings that were the quintessential status symbol of the Celtic warrior, and even everyday objects like mirrors and buckets. The Latène style spread rapidly across a vast territory from Ireland in the west to the Balkans in the east, creating a remarkable degree of cultural unity among the otherwise politically fragmented Celtic tribes. The Celtic world was not a unified empire, but a mosaic of hundreds of independent tribes, often in conflict with one another, who shared a common language family, similar religious beliefs, and this distinctive material culture. They were renowned throughout the ancient world as fierce and formidable warriors, feared for their wild charges into battle, often fighting with their hair spiked with lime and their bodies painted. Their society was dominated by a warrior elite, but it also included a powerful class of priests, the Druids, who served as judges, teachers, and keepers of sacred knowledge and oral tradition. The Druids held immense influence, capable of stopping battles in their tracks, and their teachings provided a cohesive spiritual framework for the Celtic peoples across Europe. The influence of the Celts was immense. At their peak, their territory stretched from the Atlantic shores of Spain and Ireland, across France, Gaul, and Britain, through Central Europe, and even into Anatolia, where a group known as the Galatians settled. They sacked Rome in 390 BCE and raided Delphi in Greece, their migrations and military exploits shaping the political geography of the continent. Although they left behind no written histories of their own, their legacy endures in the languages of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, in the countless place names scattered across Europe, and in the breathtaking artistry of their metalwork. They were the dominant barbarian power in Europe north of the Alps on the eve of Rome's expansion. In the sunlit lands of the Aegean, the collapse of Mycenaean kingdoms gave rise to a new political entity, the polis, or city-state. By the 8th century BCE, hundreds of fiercely independent Greek city-states emerged, each experimenting with radical ideas of governance, including democracy in Athens. This environment sparked an explosion of intellectual and artistic achievement. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and innovations in art, architecture, and literature. Greek colonies spread across the Mediterranean, diffusing their culture and ideas, and interacting with diverse peoples, shaping a unique Greek identity. The legacy of these city-states laid the foundation for Western civilization. The mastery of iron transformed Europe, replacing bronze and democratizing access to tools and weapons. Iron's abundance allowed common farmers to expand agriculture and armies to grow larger and more effective. This technological leap fueled population growth, intensified warfare, and made societies more competitive and volatile. In the south, Greeks and Romans harnessed iron for expansion. In the north, Celtic tribes dominated with their own iron mastery. The stage was set for a dramatic clash between organized Mediterranean powers and the fierce tribes of Europe. By the end of the first millennium BCE, Europe was a continent of contrasts: urban Hellenistic Mediterranean societies and the tribal artistic Celtic world. Rome, rising from a small city to a Mediterranean power, absorbed Greek culture and built a disciplined, ambitious society. The Romans' military and organizational prowess positioned them to challenge the fragmented Celtic tribes to the north. The coming conflict would pit Rome's centralized literate state against the decentralized oral societies of the Celts. The outcome would reshape Europe, forging the foundations of its future. Rome's relentless rise, from a market town to a Mediterranean superpower, was driven by military discipline and political pragmatism. After defeating Carthage and Greece, Rome's rapid expansion strained its republic, leading to social inequality and civil wars. Ambitious leaders like Julius Caesar and Octavian exploited this turmoil, ending the republic and establishing the Roman Empire. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, brought stability and ushered in an era of peace and prosperity. The Roman Empire's structure and culture would profoundly shape Europe for centuries. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul brought the Celtic world under Roman control, forever linking northern Europe to the Mediterranean. Exploiting tribal divisions, Caesar's disciplined legions overcame fierce resistance, culminating in the siege of Alesia and the surrender of Vercingetorix. The devastation ended Gallic independence and began the Romanization of the region. Caesar's victories gave him the power to challenge Rome itself, leading to the fall of the Republic. In conquering Gaul, Caesar set the stage for Roman Europe and the imperial era to come. Following the rise of Augustus and the end of the civil wars, the Roman Empire entered a remarkable period of stability and relative peace that lasted for over 2 centuries, from 27 BCE to 180 CE. This era, known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was the golden age of the empire. For the first time, a single state power imposed law and order across a vast territory stretching from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the southeast, and from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. This unprecedented political unity created the conditions for a flourishing of trade, economic prosperity, and cultural exchange on a scale never before seen in Europe. It was during this long peace that Rome truly began to stitch the continent together. The backbone of this unity was Rome's incredible infrastructure, a testament to its engineering prowess. The Romans were master builders, and their most famous achievement was their vast network of roads. These were not simple dirt tracks, but sophisticated all-weather highways, built in straight lines with deep foundations and paved surfaces. Over 80,000 kilometers of these roads crisscrossed the empire, connecting every province to Rome. They were built for military purposes, allowing legions to be moved quickly to quell rebellions or defend the frontiers, but their economic impact was even greater. They became the arteries of commerce, facilitating the safe and efficient movement of goods, people, and information, effectively shrinking the vast distances of the empire and binding it into a single economic zone. Alongside the roads, the Romans built cities. The city was the fundamental building block of the empire and the primary instrument of Romanization. Across Europe, from London or Londinium to Budapest or Aquincum, the Romans founded new urban centers or developed existing settlements, all laid out on a standardized grid plan. These cities were miniature Romes, equipped with all the amenities of Roman civilization: forums for public life, basilicas for law courts, temples, public baths for hygiene and socializing, theaters, amphitheaters for gladiatorial games, and most impressively, aqueducts. These magnificent structures, which carried fresh water over many kilometers, were symbols of Rome's ability to dominate and improve upon nature, making large-scale urban life possible even in arid regions. This shared urban landscape and infrastructure fostered a common Greco-Roman culture among the provincial elites. A wealthy merchant from Gaul, a landowner from Spain, or a bureaucrat from Britain would all live in similar houses, speak Latin, wear the toga on formal occasions, and enjoy the same forms of entertainment. Roman law provided a universal legal framework that governed contracts, property rights, and citizenship, offering a predictable and stable system for all inhabitants of the empire. This created a cosmopolitan elite whose loyalty was not just to their local tribe, but to the idea of Rome itself. The Pax Romana was not just an absence of war, it was the active creation of a unified, civilized space under Roman rule. While the Roman Empire created a unified political and economic space, it was never a culturally monolithic entity. From its inception, it was fundamentally a bilingual and bicultural empire, divided into two distinct halves. The western half of the empire, encompassing Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa, was the domain of the Latin language and Roman culture. In these provinces, which had largely been tribal barbarian societies before the conquest, Rome's cultural impact was profound and transformative. The Latin language, spread by soldiers, administrators, and merchants, gradually replaced the old Celtic and Iberian tongues, eventually evolving into the modern Romance languages, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. The process of Romanization was most intense in the West. The eastern half of the empire, which included Greece, Macedonia, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, was a very different world. These were lands with ancient, sophisticated civilizations of their own, which had been deeply influenced by centuries of Greek culture following the conquests of Alexander the Great. Here, Greek, not Latin, remained the lingua franca of daily life, commerce, and intellectual discourse. While Rome held political and military power, it readily acknowledged the cultural superiority of the Greeks. Educated Romans admired Greek philosophy, literature, and art, and it was common for the sons of the Roman elite to complete their education in Athens or Rhodes. In the East, Rome did not so much impose its culture as it added a layer of Roman administration and law on top of a resilient Hellenistic foundation. This cultural linguistic divide was one of the most significant and enduring fault lines within the empire. While the elite in both halves were often bilingual, the common people were not. This created two distinct spheres of communication and cultural identity. The West looked to Rome for its cultural and political cues, while the East continued to draw from its deep Hellenistic roots. This division was not seen as a weakness during the height of the empire. Indeed, the fusion of Roman pragmatism and Greek intellectualism was one of its greatest strengths. The Romans provided the peace, law, and order, the imperium, that allowed the high culture of the Greek world to flourish and spread. However, this latent division would become increasingly pronounced over time. As the empire faced growing crises in the 3rd century CE, the administrative and logistical challenges of ruling such a vast and diverse territory became apparent. Emperors like Diocletian recognized that the empire was too large to be governed effectively by one man from one capital. He introduced the tetrarchy, a system of 4 rulers which explicitly divided the empire into eastern and western administrative zones. This practical solution only served to formalize the deep-seated cultural divide. This split would eventually become permanent, leading to the creation of 2 separate Roman empires, a decision that would have profound consequences for the long-term historical development of Europe. During the long centuries of Roman rule, the geographical and cultural concept of Europa began to solidify, though it held a different meaning than it does today. For the Romans, whose world centered on the Mediterranean Sea, which they called Mare Nostrum, our sea, the primary worldview was a tripartite one. The world was divided into 3 great land masses or continents, Africa, Asia, and Europa. This geographical understanding was inherited directly from the Greek thinkers who had first conceptualized it. Europa was generally understood to be the lands to the north of the Mediterranean, stretching from the Pillars of Hercules or the Strait of Gibraltar in the west to the Don River in the east, which was often considered the boundary with Asia. It was a geographical label, a way of organizing the map of the known world. However, the term Europa was rarely used as a political or cultural identifier by the Romans themselves. They did not think of themselves as Europeans. Their identity was overwhelmingly Roman. A citizen from Spain, Gaul, or Greece was a Romanus, a member of the great Roman Commonwealth. The unifying concept was not the continent of Europa, but the political entity of the Roman Empire and the cultural ideal of Romanitas, the quality of being Roman. The empire itself transcended continental boundaries, encompassing territories in Asia Minor and North Africa that were deeply integrated into its fabric. For a Roman, a sophisticated citizen of Alexandria in Egypt or Antioch in Syria was far more of a kindred spirit than a barbarian German living across the Rhine in the wilds of northern Europa. Despite this, the myth of Europa, the Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus, remained a popular story within the Roman world. It was retold by poets like Ovid and frequently depicted in mosaics and fresco across the empire. This demonstrates that the foundational myth that gave the continent its name was still a part of the shared cultural heritage of the Greco-Roman world. While the name didn't carry a strong political identity, it symbolized a geographical space that was increasingly being defined and unified by Roman power. It was the landmass that Rome had, for the most part, conquered and civilized. The name was there, a latent concept waiting for a new historical context to give it meaning. The true significance of Rome for the making of Europa was not in the name, but in the reality it forged on the ground. By conquering the western half of the continent and drawing a fortified frontier, the limes, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Rome created the very framework for what would later become Western Europe. This frontier, intended to keep the Germanic tribes out, inadvertently created a vast unified space where Celtic and Iberian peoples were assimilated into a common Latin-speaking, Christianizing culture. The Romans did not set out to create Europe, but by imposing a durable political, legal, and cultural unity on its western provinces, they laid the indispensable foundations upon which a distinct European identity would one day be built. The long peace of the Pax Romana began to unravel in the 3rd century CE. The empire was plunged into a 50-year period of intense crisis, characterized by constant civil war, breakaway empires, barbarian invasions, rampant inflation, and plague. This crisis of the 3rd century shook the Roman world to its core and nearly brought it to complete collapse. Although the empire was eventually stabilized by strong authoritarian emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, it was profoundly changed. The state became more militarized, more bureaucratic, and more oppressive. The old, confident pagan worldview began to falter, creating a spiritual vacuum that would be filled by a new and powerful force quietly growing within the empire's cities. This force was Christianity. Christianity had begun as a small, obscure Jewish sect in the province of Judea. Its message of salvation, universal love, equality before God, and the promise of an afterlife had a powerful appeal, particularly among the urban poor, slaves, and women. For 3 centuries, it was an underground religion, often viewed with suspicion by the Roman authorities, and periodically subjected to brutal persecutions. Christians were seen as antisocial for refusing to participate in the state cults and worship the emperor. Despite this, the faith grew relentlessly, its tight-knit communities providing a powerful social network in the increasingly unstable cities. The decisive turning point came in the early 4th century with Emperor Constantine the Great. According to tradition, on the eve of a crucial battle in 312 CE, Constantine saw a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky with the inscription, "In this sign you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields, won the battle, and attributed his victory to the power of the Christian God. A year later, with the Edict of Milan, he granted official tolerance to Christianity, ending all persecution. Constantine became the first Christian emperor, showering the church with wealth and privileges. By the end of the century, his successor Theodosius I made Christianity the official state religion, banning the old pagan cults entirely. This imperial embrace of Christianity was the most momentous development in late antiquity. It fused the institutional power of the Roman state with the spiritual authority of the Christian Church. The Church adopted the administrative structure of the empire, with bishops residing in cities and a hierarchy mirroring Roman bureaucracy. Latin became the official language of the Church in the West. This fusion ensured that as the Western Roman Empire began to crumble under barbarian migrations, a powerful unified institution, the Christian Church, would survive. It was this institution that would carry the legacy of Roman civilization, the Latin language, and a new religious identity through the chaos of the empire's fall, becoming the primary architect of the new civilization that would arise from the ashes, medieval Europe. For centuries, the fortified frontiers of the Roman Empire, those mighty Rhine and Danube rivers, stood as the dividing line between the ordered, civilized world of Rome and the tribal barbaria beyond. But by the late 4th century CE, this border was coming under immense and unsustainable pressure. What followed was a massive domino effect of human movement, often called the migration period or the barbarian invasions. The initial spark came from the distant steppes of Central Asia with the westward push of the Huns, a nomadic warrior people with a ferocious reputation. Their advance displaced the Gothic tribes living north of the Black Sea, forcing them to seek refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire. In the year 376 CE, a huge contingent of Goths was permitted to cross the Danube. This was a fateful decision, setting a precedent for the decades to come and signaling the beginning of the end for the Western Empire. This wasn't a single coordinated invasion, but rather a chaotic series of movements involving numerous Germanic tribes. The Franks, Alemanni, Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, and Lombards were all set in motion, driven by pressure from the Huns, climate change, and the allure of Roman wealth. These weren't just raiding parties. Many were entire peoples on the move, warriors, women, children seeking new lands to settle. They were both migrants and invaders, sometimes negotiating as Roman allies called foederati, and other times carving out kingdoms through force of arms. The Roman state, already weakened by internal division, economic strain, and political instability, struggled with this demographic pressure. The Western Empire found it increasingly difficult to recruit and pay its own legions. It became reliant on hiring Germanic warriors to defend its borders, often against other Germanic groups. This created a dangerous feedback loop, giving barbarian leaders military experience, knowledge of Roman tactics, and increasing influence within Roman structure. The defenders were often indistinguishable from the attackers, which blurred the lines and hastened fragmentation. The culmination of this pressure was a series of traumatic events that shattered Roman invincibility. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked the city of Rome itself, an event that hadn't happened in 800 years and sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. Later, in 455 CE, the city was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, who had migrated from Central Europe through Gaul and Spain to North Africa. These were catastrophic blows to Roman prestige and power. They demonstrated the central government could no longer guarantee security of its own heartland, let alone its vast provinces. The Western Roman Empire was being dismantled, piece, by peoples it could no longer control. The year 476 CE is the date most historians give for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In reality, it wasn't some spectacular fiery collapse, more like a final quiet fizzle in a long process of decline. By this time, the Western Roman Emperor's authority was little more than a hollow fiction. Real power rested with Germanic generals, who commanded what remained of the army and acted as kingmakers, appointing and deposing puppet emperors at will. The emperor controlled little more than Italy, with Gaul, Spain, and North Africa in the hands of Germanic kingdoms. The empire was an empire in name only, a ghost haunting its former territories. The specific event in 476 was the deposition of the last emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, combining Rome's founder and first emperor's names. He was removed not by an external invader, but by his own commander, Odoacer. Crucially, Odoacer didn't appoint another emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, saying one emperor was enough. This was a recognition of reality. The Western Empire had ceased to function, and Odoacer now ruled Italy as king. For people in Rome, the change was barely perceptible. The aftermath saw final fragmentation of the unified Roman West. The dream of universal law was replaced by successor kingdoms. The Visigoths ruled Spain, the Franks consolidated power in Gaul, The Burgundians held the Rhone Valley, the Vandals controlled North Africa, and the Ostrogoths under Theodoric would soon supplant Odoacer in Italy. These Germanic rulers didn't destroy Roman civilization, they admired it and wanted to preserve it. They adopted Roman administrative techniques, issued laws based on Roman codes, and minted coins with the Eastern Emperor's image, maintaining imperial continuity. However, the reality on the ground was profound disruption and decay. The unified economic system disintegrated. Long-distance trade collapsed as roads fell into disrepair and seas became infested with pirates. Cities dependent on trade and imperial administration began to shrink dramatically. The great stone amphitheatres, aqueducts and forums fell into ruin, their stones quarried for cruder buildings. Life became more localized, more rural and more dangerous. A new post-Roman world emerged, defined not by a single emperor but by kings, bishops and local strongmen. In the wake of the empire's collapse in the west, the new Germanic kings saw themselves not as destroyers but as heirs to the Roman legacy. They were a tiny ruling minority, often only tens of thousands, presiding over millions of Gallo-Roman population. To govern effectively, they co-opted existing Roman infrastructure and personnel. They relied on educated Roman aristocracy to staff bureaucracies, collect taxes, and administer justice. Latin remained the language of government and law. Kings like Theodoric the Great and Visigothic rulers adopted Roman titles, dress, and court ceremonial, wrapping barbarian authority in imperial tradition. They were attempting to run Roman provinces without a Roman emperor. This created a hybrid civilization, Germanic military leadership fused with Roman culture. Legal systems reflected this, with separate law codes for Germanic and Roman populations. Over time, distinctions began to blur. Germanic warrior elite intermarried with Roman aristocracy, creating unified nobility. Germanic languages slowly faded, surviving in place names and loanwords in evolving Latin vernaculars, the future Romance languages. The conquerors were culturally conquered by the civilization they had overthrown. The ghost of empire was powerful and persistent. Of all successor kingdoms, the Franks proved most durable and influential, established in Gaul. Their success came from King Clovis, who around 496 made a brilliant decision. Unlike other Germanic rulers who adopted Arian Christianity, Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity. This single act allied him with Gallo-Roman bishops and Catholic population, giving him legitimacy his rivals lacked. This alliance between Frankish military power and Roman Church became the cornerstone of the New West. Still, the idea of unified Roman Empire never truly died. It lived as political ideal. Memory of Golden Age leaders tried to replicate. This was demonstrated by Eastern Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. From Constantinople, he launched ambitious campaigns to reconquer Western provinces. His general Belisarius destroyed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa and wrested Italy from Ostrogoths after devastating warfare. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was a Roman lake again. But the effort exhausted Eastern resources and gains were lost. The dream was powerful, but fragmentation was stronger. As the political and economic unity of the Western Roman Empire shattered, a new and more powerful unifying force rose to take its place, the Christian Church. In a world of political chaos, violence, and collapsing institutions, the Church offered the only source of stability, continuity, and shared identity that transcended the new political borders. The Bishop of Rome, who increasingly claimed primacy as the Pope and the heir to St. Peter, began to assert his authority as the spiritual leader of the West. While kings and warlords battled for territory, the Church, with its organized hierarchy of bishops and priests, its network of monasteries, and its common Latin liturgy, provided a coherent cultural and religious framework that bound the diverse peoples of the post-Roman West together. The concept of Romanitas was slowly being replaced by the idea of Christianitas, or Christendom. Monasteries, in particular, became vital centers for the preservation and transmission of knowledge in this fragmented age. From the windswept coasts of Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire but was enthusiastically Christianized, to the heartlands of Italy and Gaul, monastic communities became islands of literacy in a sea of illiteracy. Monks like the Benedictines, following the rule of St. Benedict, dedicated their lives to prayer and work, ora et labora. A crucial part of this work was the painstaking process of copying manuscripts in their scriptoria. They copied not only the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, but also the great works of classical Latin authors like Virgil and Cicero. Without the tireless efforts of these monastic scribes, much of the literary heritage of the ancient world would have been lost forever. The Church also played a central role in converting the new Germanic rulers and their peoples, a process that was essential for the creation of a unified European culture. Missionaries, often sent from Rome or from the dynamic monastic centres in Ireland and England, bravely ventured into pagan lands to spread the faith. The conversion of a king, like that of Clovis of the Franks, was a pivotal event, as his warriors and subjects would typically follow his lead. This process of Christianization was the primary vehicle through which Roman culture, embedded within the Latin language and the structure of the Church, was transmitted to the Germanic peoples. It was a slow and often difficult process, but it gradually created a shared religious identity that smoothed over ethnic differences and laid the foundation for a common civilization. This growing sense of a unified Christendom was powerfully reinforced by the rise of a new rival faith, Islam. In the 7th century, the armies of Islam erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula, conquering the Persian Empire and the Roman provinces of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa with breathtaking speed. In 711, a Muslim army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swiftly conquered the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. For the first time, the Christian lands of the West faced a powerful, expansionist, and ideologically unified external threat. This confrontation helped to sharpen the sense of a collective Christian European identity defined in opposition to the Islamic world. The word Europeans Europenses is famously used for the first time in a chronicle describing the Frankish victory over a Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in 732, a sign that a new continental consciousness was beginning to emerge. Out of the fragmented world of the early Middle Ages, one figure rose to dominate the continent and give new life to the idea of a unified West. This was Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, the King of the Franks. A brilliant military commander, a skilled administrator, and a man of boundless energy, Charlemagne inherited the powerful Frankish kingdom and, over a reign of more than 4 decades, expanded it into a vast empire. Through a relentless series of annual campaigns, he conquered the Lombards in Italy, pushed back the Muslims in Spain, subdued the Saxons in Germany, and defeated the Avars in Central Europe. By the year 800, his empire encompassed what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, and much of Italy, uniting most of Western Christendom under a single ruler for the first time since the days of Rome. Charlemagne's ambition was not merely military. He sought to create a genuine Christian Roman Empire reborn in the West. He gathered the brightest scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen, men like the English monk Alcuin of York, to spearhead a remarkable cultural and intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This revival aimed to reform the Church, standardize religious practice, and improve literacy and learning throughout the empire. A new, clear and legible script, Carolingian minuscule, was developed to make the copying of manuscripts easier and more accurate. This intellectual project was a conscious effort to restore the learning and order of the Roman past in the service of a renewed Christian society. For the first time, leaders were actively thinking in terms of a unified European Christian culture. The symbolic peak of Charlemagne's reign occurred on Christmas Day in the year 800. While kneeling in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and acclaimed him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. This momentous act had profound implications. It was a declaration of independence from the Eastern Roman or Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, who still claimed authority over the whole Roman world. It cemented the powerful alliance between the papacy and the Frankish monarchy, and it resurrected the political ideal of the Western Roman Empire. The title implied that Charlemagne was the legitimate successor of Augustus and Constantine, the Christian protector of a unified Western Christendom, which was now increasingly being referred to in texts as Europa. Although Charlemagne's vast empire would not long survive his death, fracturing among his grandsons into the kingdoms that would eventually form the core of modern France and Germany, his legacy was immense. He had given a tangible political and geographical shape to the idea of Western Europe. He had reinforced the notion that its identity was inseparable from the Roman past and the Catholic faith. The memory of his empire, a unified Christian Europe ruled by a Roman emperor in partnership with the Pope, would become the central political myth of the Middle Ages. It was the moment when the fragmented territories of the post-Roman West were first forged into a coherent entity with a shared identity, a true Europe rising from the ashes of the fallen empire. The memory of Charlemagne's empire, a unified Christian West, resonated throughout the Middle Ages, but the term Europe itself remained largely secondary to the more powerful concept of Christendom. It was the great cultural upheaval of the Renaissance, beginning in Italy in the 14th century, that truly brought the name and idea of Europe back to the forefront. Renaissance scholars, the humanists, were obsessed with the classical past. They delved into rediscovered Greek and Roman texts, seeking to revive the wisdom, art, and worldview of antiquity. In doing so, they moved beyond a purely religious framework and began to see the world through the geographical and secular lenses of classical authors like Herodotus and Ptolemy. For these ancient writers, Europa was a distinct geographical entity, and the humanists eagerly adopted this perspective. This intellectual shift was powerfully amplified by the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century. For the first time, maps and texts could be reproduced accurately and in large quantities, spreading new ideas and a new understanding of geography across the continent. Cartographers, inspired by the rediscovery of Ptolemy's Geographia, began to create maps that depicted Europe not just as a spiritual realm, but as a specific, defined landmass. These maps often personified the continent as Europa Regina, Queen Europe, a crowned female figure whose body corresponded to the continent's shape, with Iberia as her head and crown, and Italy and Denmark as her arms. This powerful image visually reinforced the idea of Europe as a single, coherent, and dominant entity. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 provided another crucial impetus for the development of a European identity. The final collapse of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire sent a shockwave through the West and removed the last direct political link to ancient Rome. It also created a clear and present threat on Europe's southeastern flank, sharpening the distinction between a Christian Europe and a Muslim Ottoman world. In the face of this external pressure, popes and princes increasingly used the term Europe in their calls for unity and crusades, framing the conflict not just as one of faith, but as a defense of a shared European civilization against an alien Asiatic power. The idea of Europe was being forged in the crucible of this new geopolitical reality. Thus, during the Renaissance, the concept of Europe underwent a profound transformation. It evolved from a vague mythological and geographical term into a much more concrete cultural and political idea. It was seen as the heir to the double legacy of Greco-Roman antiquity and Judeo-Christian faith. A continent distinguished by its unique history, its intellectual dynamism, and its artistic genius. While Christendom remained a powerful identifier, Europe now offered a more secular and culturally rich framework for a shared identity, one that celebrated human achievement and a distinct historical trajectory. This rediscovery and redefinition of Europe laid the essential intellectual groundwork for the modern era. Just as Europeans were redefining their continent's identity from within, a series of audacious sea voyages in the late 15th and 16th centuries began to redefine it from without. The age of discovery, led by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, really shattered the old medieval map of the world. The voyages of Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan revealed vast continents and oceans that were previously unknown to Europeans. Suddenly, Europe was no longer the center of a small tripartite world of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was just one part of a much larger and more complex globe. This dramatic expansion of geographical horizons had a profound impact on the European sense of self, forcing a complete re-evaluation of their place in the world. This encounter with a vast and diverse array of new peoples and civilizations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia was, honestly, a pivotal moment in the formation of European identity. For the first time, Europeans were confronted with societies that were radically different from their own, with different religions, social structures, and technologies. This encounter prompted an intense and often brutal process of comparison and categorization. In trying to understand and describe these non-European cultures, often labeled as primitive, savage, or barbarian, Europeans simultaneously began to define themselves in opposition. European identity became increasingly articulated not just by what it was, but by what it was not. To be European in this new global context increasingly meant to be Christian, in contrast to the pagans of the Americas or the heathens of Asia. It meant to be civilized, possessing writing, complex laws, and monumental architecture, as opposed to the supposedly uncivilized societies they encountered. Most significantly, it meant to be technologically advanced, possessing the ships, firearms, and navigational tools that made this global expansion possible. This emerging sense of European superiority, rooted in a combination of religious conviction and technological advantage, became a powerful justification for the colonial enterprises that followed, allowing Europeans to rationalize the conquest and exploitation of other peoples and their lands. The wealth that flowed back to Europe from these new colonial empires, gold and silver from the Americas, spices from the East Indies, fueled an economic boom that further solidified Europe's sense of its own dynamism and preeminence. This new global dominance reinforced the idea that Europe was unique and exceptional, a continent destined to lead the world. The term Europe thus acquired a new layer of meaning during this period. It was no longer just a geographical or cultural concept. It became synonymous with modernity, power, and progress. The continent's identity was being forged on a global stage, shaped by its interactions with and its domination over the rest of the world. While the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery fostered a broader sense of a common European identity, another powerful force was at the same time working to fragment the continent from within. The early modern period, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, was marked by the consolidation of centralized states and the birth of a new and potent form of collective identity: nationalism. The old medieval ideal of a universal Christendom ruled by Pope and Emperor gave way to a system of competing sovereign states: France, Spain, England, Sweden, and others, each demanding the primary loyalty of its subjects. People began to think of themselves less as subjects of Christendom and more as French, English, or Spanish. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century shattered the religious unity of Western Europe, providing a powerful catalyst for this process. The schism between Catholic and Protestant nations created deep and enduring ideological rifts, leading to over a century of devastating religious wars. This conflict permanently destroyed the idea of a single, unified Christendom and reinforced the primacy of the state in religious matters. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, enshrined the principle of state sovereignty, establishing the legal framework for the modern European state system. Europe was now officially a continent of distinct, independent, and often rivalrous political entities. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this state-based loyalty evolved into a more passionate and popular nationalism. The French Revolution in particular spread the powerful idea that sovereignty resided not with the monarch but with the people or the nation. This revolutionary concept inspired movements across Europe as people began to define their nations based on shared language, culture, history, and ethnicity. This was the age of national awakenings, of collecting folk tales, standardizing languages, and writing national histories. The primary identity for most people became their national identity, and Europe became an arena for intense competition and ultimately devastating conflict between these proud and ambitious nation-states. This rise of nationalism created a fundamental paradox that continues to define Europe to this day. On one hand, the nations of Europe saw themselves as fundamentally distinct and in competition with one another. On the other, they were all clearly part of a shared civilization. A Frenchman and a German might be political rivals, but they shared a common heritage of Roman law, Greek philosophy, Christian religion, and Enlightenment thought that made them both recognizably European when contrasted with someone from China or Peru. The European identity was thus not a single, unified feeling, but a complex, multi-layered reality, a constant tension between the particularism of the nation and the universalism of a shared continental culture. The catastrophic bloodshed of the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century, which were in many ways the tragic culmination of centuries of European national rivalries, forced a radical rethinking of the continent's identity. The wars, which began as European civil wars before engulfing the globe, left the continent devastated, economically ruined, and politically divided by the Iron Curtain. In the ashes of this self-destruction, a new and powerful vision for Europe emerged, one that sought to transcend the toxic nationalism that had led to the disaster. Visionaries like Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet argued that the only way to ensure lasting peace was to bind the nations of Europe together in a web of shared interests. This led to the birth of the European project, a gradual process of economic and political integration that began with the European coal and steel community in 1951. The core idea was simple but revolutionary. By pooling sovereignty over key industries, especially those necessary for war, former enemies like France and Germany could make future conflict between them not only unthinkable but materially impossible. This pragmatic, step-by-step approach evolved through various stages: the European Economic Community, the European Community, and finally the European Union. This project was a conscious attempt to build a new kind of European identity, one based not on ethnicity or empire, but on shared values of peace, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Today, the question of European identity is more complex and contested than ever. The European Union has created a space of unprecedented peace and cooperation, with open borders, a single currency for many of its members, and a shared citizenship. For many, to be European means to be part of this community of values, to enjoy the freedom to travel, work, and live anywhere within the Union. It represents a post-national identity, a commitment to a larger, ever-closer union that complements rather than replaces national identities. The motto of the European Union, United in Diversity, perfectly encapsulates this aspiration to build unity while respecting the continent's deep-rooted linguistic and cultural differences. Yet this project is not without its challenges. The very success of the EU has prompted debates about its future, its democratic legitimacy, and the limits of its expansion. Issues like migration, economic crises, and the rise of populist and nationalist movements have all placed stress on the ideal of European unity. The identity of Europe remains a work in progress, an ongoing conversation, and a political project. It is the culmination of a long and winding story, from a mythical princess on the back of a bull to a complex political union, forever grappling with the enduring tension between its fragmentation and its unity, its diversity and its shared destiny. Our epic journey through the story of Europe has taken us across a vast expanse of time, from the wind-swept, ice-bound landscapes of 40,000 years ago to the complex political unions of the 21st century. We began with the continent's earliest pioneers, the Cro-Magnon hunters, who left their enigmatic art in the deep darkness of caves, a testament to the dawn of the human spirit on this land. We witnessed the profound upheaval of the Neolithic Revolution as migrating farmers from the east brought with them the seeds of a new world, transforming the wilderness into a patchwork of fields and permanent settlements. This narrative of migration and transformation became a recurring theme, a fundamental rhythm in the symphony of European history, setting a precedent for the waves of change that would continuously reshape the continent. We then followed the thunderous arrival of the Indo-European speakers from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a people who brought with them the horse, the wheel, and a new linguistic and genetic blueprint that would define the continent for millennia. From their dispersal arose the great peoples of ancient Europe, the Celts with their swirling art, the Greeks who birthed philosophy and democracy in their sun-drenched city-states, and the Italic tribes who would lay the foundations for an empire. The subsequent ages of bronze and iron accelerated this development, forging a world of warrior chieftains, long-distance traders, and increasingly sophisticated societies, setting the stage for a new era of unification through conquest, an era that would be dominated by the singular power of Rome. It was Rome that first stitched a significant portion of the continent together, imposing a remarkable unity of law, language, and infrastructure. The Pax Romana created a vast interconnected space where ideas and goods could flow freely, and it was within this crucible that the geographical name Europa, inherited from a Greek myth, became attached to a tangible, civilized realm. Yet the fall of this mighty empire did not spell the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. From the fragments of the Roman West, a new civilization emerged, one forged from the fusion of Roman legacy, Germanic warrior culture, and the powerful, unifying faith of Christianity, which provided a new spiritual glue for a fractured world. Through the medieval period, the Renaissance, and the Age of Discovery, this nascent European identity continued to evolve. It was defined by the memory of Charlemagne's reborn empire, rediscovered through the lens of classical antiquity and sharpened by encounters with the wider world. This long, sweeping narrative reveals that Europe is not the product of a single people or a single moment, but the cumulative result of countless layers of migration, conquest, innovation, and exchange. It is a rich and intricate tapestry woven from the diverse threads of hunters and farmers, pagans and Christians, barbarians and emperors, each contributing to the complex pattern we see today. One of the most profound truths that emerges from this long historical survey is that Europe's identity is defined by an enduring paradox. It is a story of simultaneous unity and fragmentation. From the very beginning, the continent's geography, a peninsula of peninsulas crisscrossed by mountain ranges and rivers, fostered the development of distinct regional cultures. Yet, at the same time, these geographical features were never insurmountable barriers, and the continent has always been a space of dynamic interaction, trade, and movement. This inherent tension between the local and the continental, the particular and the universal, is perhaps the single most important key to understanding the European experience. It is a continent destined by its own geography and history to be forever diverse, yet inextricably linked. This paradox is visible in every era we have explored. The world of the Celtic tribes was a mosaic of hundreds of independent, rivalrous groups, yet they were bound by a shared Laterna artistic style and a common spiritual framework overseen by the Druids. The Greek world was a fiercely competitive collection of city-states, constantly at war with one another, yet they all recognized themselves as Hellenes, united by language, religion, and a shared sense of cultural superiority over the barbarian world. This pattern of cultural unity coexisting with political fragmentation became a permanent feature of the continental landscape, a stark contrast to the more monolithic, centralized empires that often characterized other parts of the world. Even the great unifying forces in European history ultimately gave way to this tendency towards fragmentation. The Roman Empire, for all its power, could not erase the deep cultural fault line between its Latin West and Greek East, a division that would eventually become a permanent political split. Charlemagne's attempt to resurrect a unified Western Empire was a monumental achievement, but it fractured within a generation, creating the kernels of the future nations of France and Germany. The universal authority of the medieval papacy was shattered by the Reformation, which splintered Christendom and reinforced the rise of sovereign nation-states, each fiercely protective of its own identity and interests. This dynamic of unity in diversity, or perhaps more accurately, unity through diversity, is not a weakness but the defining characteristic of European civilization. It has created a continent of constant competition, which in turn has fueled relentless innovation in science, politics, art, and technology. It has fostered a deep-seated respect for regional identities and languages, while simultaneously creating a broad, shared cultural heritage. The modern European Union, with its motto "United in Diversity," is the most recent and ambitious attempt to manage this ancient paradox, seeking to build a framework for cooperation that does not extinguish the vibrant national and regional cultures that make the continent so uniquely dynamic. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, Europe stands as a continent of over 700 million people, home to 44 countries and hundreds of languages, a living testament to the deep and complex story we have traced. The journey from the Ice Age hunter to the modern EU citizen is a narrative of almost unimaginable transformation. It is a story that has been shaped by the slow, patient work of farmers clearing the land, the grand visions of emperors, the piety of monks, the genius of artists and scientists, and the passionate loyalties of nations. This history has left an indelible mark on the landscape, from the megalithic tombs of the Neolithic to the ruins of Roman forums and the spires of Gothic cathedrals. The quest to understand what it means to be European is an ongoing conversation, a narrative that is constantly being written and rewritten. The continent's identity is not a static artifact to be found in a museum, but a living, breathing entity, shaped by present-day challenges and future aspirations as much as by the weight of its past. Issues of migration, economic integration, national sovereignty, and Europe's role in a rapidly changing global landscape continue to force a re-examination of the very meaning of Europe. The story is far from over. We are all living in its next chapter, and the continent's future direction is still very much being debated and decided. From a mythical Phoenician princess carried across the sea on the back of a bull, to a complex political union grappling with the challenges of the 21st century, the idea of Europe has been in a state of perpetual motion. It is this dynamism, this capacity for reinvention, that has been the engine of its history. The story of Europe is ultimately a human story on a grand scale, a story of resilience, creativity, conflict, and the unending search for identity and community. It serves as a powerful reminder that our present is profoundly shaped by the distant past, and that the story of a place is and always will be the story of its people. As we conclude this particular journey, we recognize that we have only scratched the surface of this immense and fascinating narrative. Each era, each culture, each nation holds countless more stories waiting to be explored. The tale of Europe is not a single documentary, but a vast library, and its final pages have yet to be written. The continent's history is a shared heritage for all of humanity, a compelling drama of how a small and fractious peninsula transformed itself, and in doing so transformed the entire world. The story continues, and its next turns remain as unpredictable and as full of potential as any moment in its long and storied past.